It started in a university lecture hall where JD Vance, invited as a guest speaker to a graduate-level seminar on public leadership and cultural narratives, took his place at the front of the room with the confidence of a rising political figure. And though the audience comprised of diverse students and faculty greeted him with polite applause, an undercurrent of tension already simmered. For his past statements and positions had often sparked controversy, particularly among students from minority backgrounds who viewed his perspectives as reductive or self-serving, and it was within this setting that the conversation turned, perhaps inevitably, toward figures of influence in American media and culture. At which point Vance casually referenced Denzel Washington as an example of Hollywood elitism cloaked in respectability, a comment delivered with an almost dismissive tone as if he were swatting down a myth, saying that Denzel talks about hard work and integrity. But what does he actually know about real struggle outside a script? Remark that hung in the air like smoke, not shouted, not aggressive, but cutting nonetheless. Several students shifted uncomfortably, some visibly bristled, and one African-American student in the front row whispered something to her peer. But before anyone else could speak, a quiet voice rose from the back of the room, an elderly professor, Dr. Lenora Wallace, who had until then remained silent, sitting with her hands folded neatly on the desk like she had done for decades. The kind of academic whose presence carried more weight than any title she held, and as she slowly stood, the room shifted with her, the kind of reverence you can't fake or force settling in like a hush. She addressed Vance without hostility, without fanfare, simply saying, "Mr. Vance, I fear you've misread the man entirely." What followed was a calm but devastating dismantling of his point, not through anger or confrontation, but through context, lived history, and scholarship. Dr. Wallace began recounting Denzel Washington's early life. Raised in a working-class family in Mount Vernon, New York, the son of a Pentecostal preacher and a beauty parlor owner, whose discipline and structure weren't inherited from fame but forged in community institutions and after-school programs. In navigating identity in a nation that rarely saw black men as complex or noble, she spoke of how Denzel's portrayal of black excellence wasn't a Hollywood fiction, but a reclamation, a statement that black characters could be heroic, flawed, principled, and unapologetically human all at once. She referenced the rigor of his performances, his loyalty to stagecraft, his decision to produce and direct stories that uplifted others rather than center his own celebrity, and how through decades of consistent, principled work he had become a symbol of integrity, not by branding but by being what so many aspired to become: committed, grounded, and uncorrupted. JD Vance, caught off guard, attempted to interject, to argue that cultural icons have an obligation to confront the systemic failings of their own industries, but Dr. Wallace gently but firmly reminded him that Denzel had, time and again, chosen roles and projects that resisted stereotypes and opened doors, she cited fences, where he refused to allow Hollywood to dilute August Wilson's language for palatability, and The Great Debaters, where he brought forgotten black intellectuals to the screen, giving them the dignity history had denied. Example, her voice never rose, but its effect was undeniable, until the classroom that once buzzed with tension now simmered with reflection. Then something unexpected happened. A student raised their hand and asked Vance whether his criticism came from personal conviction or political posturing, and this time Vance paused, genuinely taken aback by the question's clarity, and for the first time that afternoon, he seemed to consider the weight of what he had said, realizing perhaps that his comment wasn't about Denzel at all, but about what Denzel represented, a kind of dignity that couldn't be co-opted, a quiet authority, earned over decades, one that challenged those who used their platforms to divide rather than uplift. The professor continued not with rebuke, but with invitation, suggesting that Vance rewatch some of Denzel's interviews not just as a critic, but as a student test, especially the ones where he speaks about the responsibility of being black in the spotlight, the balance between private self and public role, the costs of carrying a community's hopes on shoulders, never meant to bear them alone. By the time the class ended, the energy in the room had changed. Vance, though not defeated, had been humbled, not through shame, but through witnessing a truth larger than himself, and students, once passive listeners, had become active participants. In a conversation far deeper than political optics, over the next week, word of the exchange spread beyond the classroom, first through group chats, then student forums, then blogs, and eventually into mainstream media, where it was reported with headlines ranging from "Professor shuts down," JD Vance over Denzel comments, to "Academia checks political cynicism with cultural truth," but the moment itself remained pure. It's untouched by media spin, because those who were there knew it wasn't about humiliation or confrontation, but clarity. Denzel Washington himself, when asked about it in a later interview, simply nodded and said, "Sometimes the story tells itself. You just have to be quiet long enough to hear it." And in that moment, it was clear he understood the deeper victory that it wasn't about defending his name, but about defending something much more sacred, the truth of lived experience over opportunistic judgment. JD Vance never publicly addressed the incident again. But in future lectures, students noticed his tone change slightly less performative, more reflective, as if he, too, had been transformed, not through debate, but through the presence of someone who knew that power doesn't need to shout to be heard. Asterisk.